For the audience benefit, to give you a little bit of history of what Encompass has done over the last year, our board, looking at emerging trends and technologies over a year and a half ago, recommended that Encompass establish a center through our nonprofit foundation called the Artificial Intelligence, or AI, Competition Center. And at that point, we began to fill out an advisory council that looked to both university hubs. We have Richard Harknett from the Portman Center, the University of Cincinnati, the Narrative Intelligence Center at my alma mater, University of Mississippi, Joe Stradinger. Then we had Bobby Robbins, who's president of the University of Arizona, former president of the Texas Medical Center, leader of MD Anderson and tremendous cancer research, combined with the AI companies represented in the Encompass membership. But we were able to go out and find some really good companies. And those that are on the panel today, General Catalyst, the third largest venture capital fund in the world, that is really funding and finding the startups, the little tech, the emerging tech, the new tech, and the innovation. Meta, Victoria, really a leader in open source AI and all the competition and innovation that comes out of that. We partnered, Encompass partnered with the Blue Owl Group, Colin Crowell, and a tremendously talented team of his associates and allies. We went out and did something non-traditional. We recruited a company like Canva, consumer forward-facing, innovative design company that is really a leader of all forms of AI. Today as a guest, we have Palantir that we're very fortunate to have, is what they're bringing to all types of different disruptions, both in government and procurement and acquisition and in technology. And this conversation is meant to continue Encompass's longstanding advocacy for competition in each decade and each iteration of technology. Open source AI, we believe, represents the most competitive, innovative option, and it combines with all the other language models, both closed, proprietary, as well as open, to create the greatest level of competition in the marketplace. And so our panel and our discussion today is to talk about the benefits of open source, what it means. And with that, Colin, I'm going to let you begin the conversation to define for the audience your view of open source, or how you would define open source. And then I'd like the rest of the panel just to kind of give their backgrounds, their story, and the issues most important to them.
Thanks, Chip. It's a delight to be, I will admit my mind is still somewhat stuck on Section 230. But I think to keep things simple, the way to think about open source is to think about a couple of key attributes. One is transparency and the ability to look under the hood and have insight into how the technology is working and how the app or the AI service is functioning. The second attribute at a high level would be collaboration. Open source methodologies typically allow collaboration across time and space into that. It can also be thought of in contrast to what it's not. The closed proprietary systems are not transparent, and they don't foster that same kind of openness and collaboration. So I think people can get into sort of Talmudic discussions about what open source means in a very technical way. But for public policy purposes, it's about openness, collaboration, transparency, and the ability to spark entrepreneurial entry, to spark and promote greater innovation. And that's been the history of open systems, open networks across the technology sector for decades.
Miriam.
It's so nice to be here, and not to continue the theme of 230, but when they asked Colin if he wrote it and people laughed, he actually is one of the drafters of 230. So that was serious. So I just wanted people to put that on the record. But I am so delighted to be here as well. And for those of you that don't know General Catalyst, we really focus on investing. It's not a traditional venture capital firm, but it has its roots in venture capital. And we really aim to invest in what we consider are critical industries that make a nation stronger, global resilience, national resilience, and that really spans the gamut from energy, industrial manufacturing, defense, financial services, and healthcare. And AI and open source is just cross-cutting across all those industries and is really amazing to see what open source and AI is doing in a situation like ours. We have the privilege of seeing technology that hopefully will soon, within a few years, maybe a few months, will be used by thousands or millions of people. So it's almost like we're looking into the future. And so what our CEO wanted to do was to create the General Catalyst Institute, where I am the Chief Public Policy Officer, and where we aim to try to help governments understand the latest technologies and to help shape public policies to leverage those technologies. And that involves collaborating with governments, educating governments, explaining really what's happening in defense tech and the autonomous weapons that they're creating, or in energy, or in healthcare, and how AI is really changing the way non-clinical work can work and have better patient outcomes to make it more accessible, affordable, and proactive. And so we have a CEO, Hemant Taneja, who really believes that by leveraging these technologies, we can have a transformative effect on that industry. And I think healthcare is a good example that it really touches all of us. And, having been, maybe you experienced some frustration with getting your data from one doctor to another. AI and the ability to just, take your data with you and have the system talk to each other, and those types of ways of collaborating across systems are going to really, I think, have a huge impact. So we are also there as a resource to our startups and to have them understand the way that policymakers may be approaching a certain issue that is going to regulate their industry. And so we just, really get excited to try to bring those two groups together and see what can happen, and hopefully to transform those industries.
Victoria, discuss Llama, what it means, why Meta has become a leading champion of open source AI, and why it's so important as we look at the race with China globally, but also we have little tech, small tech, and a major platform. How do we have the ability to bridge from the startup to the large platform around open source?
Thanks. And first, I'd like to co-sign everything that you just said. It kind of undergirds my comments today. And the secret sauce there is open source. So at Meta, we have it's deep in our corporate DNA, open source projects, whether it's PyTorch or other projects. And as a former antitrust lawyer, recovering antitrust lawyer, I couldn't be more excited to be working on an open source project like Llama and the other things that we're bringing to market that are truly transformational. And that's something that is good for everyone. It's good for us, just transparently. We benefit from having all of our stuff out there and having the tires kicked by not just thousands, but millions of great minds, and providing that feedback and making the models all the better. But it's also fertile soil from which other growth can happen, whether it's startups, whether it's medium tech, whether it's a large industry player from an analog industry, even as they go through their transformation in the AI age. And so that is a critical part of winning the global competition that we're in with China. Whether we want that competition or not, it is here. And there's room for both open and closed. I'm here to talk about open, but I'm sure there are folks who could explain the benefits of closed models, but we need both. And part of that is that when you have open source models, you are not just opening the door to invite someone in to use the technology, you are handing them the engine. and they can take that engine and build anything. And that's really powerful, not just here for growth in the United States and innovation in the United States, but around the world. We want other economic actors and other countries to be adopting American models that reflect certain American values. And I think that strategy is reflected by what our greatest competitor is doing, which is China has in fact released hundreds of open source models. And so becoming part of that sort of substrate, AI substrate globally, it's critical that the US win that race.
Kara?
Thanks, Chip. Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Hinesley from Canva. As actually, quick show of hands, who in here is familiar with Canva? Oh my gosh, y'all just made my day. Thanks. So depending on my audience, sometimes people are a little less familiar, but it looks like we have a lot of Canva power users in the audience. As you would probably know, we are working to democratize design and really empower people to be able to create things from anywhere. And we started out with that design focus, but we've really started to grow into a productivity software company. And in that, AI has really supercharged all of it. We've been in that unique position as kind of a growing medium company. We started as a startup, but we've kind of come on up. And we use AI in a lot of different ways. And so we have our own proprietary models that we've developed, but we also license a lot of the foundational models, some of which representatives are here today. And then we've also really utilized a lot of open source AI models to fine tune, but to also be able to share back a lot of our learnings. And so we also put in a lot of tweaks and models back into the open source community, especially around, we did some really great work in debiasing, as well as some security patches. And so we've seen that really be able to not only uplift our own products, but also making sure that we're helping other people that are coming up either behind us or other companies that are in a similar space. So we've really, I think, seen that benefit of the open source community. And one of the reasons we actually joined INCOMPAS and the AICC was because they were taking a holistic look at that whole AI tech stack. So everything from the infrastructure and the energy to the consumer facing piece like Canva, really looking at all of those kind of wide ranging policy solutions and ideas that we think are going to really supercharge the collaboration in the space that we need as we move towards the future.
Anthony?
Hi, thank you for inviting me here. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water. My background is technical. I'm head of AI implementation for Palantir, and I've spent a lot of time building models. And so it's just looking at that last panel and the kind of legalistic back and forth. I'm a little concerned on what I might have gotten myself into up here. So I appreciate your patience with me. Palantir is a technology company. We build data management platforms for government and for commercial entities with applications built on top of them that span everything from helping our warfighters to optimizing factory supply lines to doctors, healthcare management issues, and dealing with insurance and things like that. We use open source models all the time. We also use closed source models, and the open source ecosystem gives us a lot of options that absent its existence we wouldn't have in terms of where we can deploy, how quickly we can get things onto classified networks, the size of models, right? The speed of models, working on the edge, working on edge devices. So we really use open source all the time. I want to kind of step back. So a lot of people, there's a lot of reasons to support open source. And I think there actually isn't an option, meaning that the taking the other side of the open source question is not really viable. So for large language models in particular, there's a couple trends, and you'll have to, this is where I'm not going to cite law, but I'm going to cite math, including that performance is growing logarithmically with compute, that compute is growing exponentially, and models are being more efficient, which means that there aren't going to be sort of closed winner take all. The ecosystem's not going to be a closed winner take all ecosystem. And I'm happy to sort of spell out what I mean by these things if you want to come up and talk afterwards. There's going to necessarily be a lot of players, including open source. We can't stop China from developing open source competitors to OpenAI. Like that's just not gonna happen. So the question then is, what should we be doing, and what should the U.S. government do? And I think it's sort of there's two facets to this that I think really drive things. So one is it needs to support the AI ecosystem as a whole. So that includes open source models, closed source models, academic research, right? The whole, jobs, workforce training, sort of that whole very holistic view of the entirety of the AI ecosystem. That's kind of what one thing that it needs to do. And the other, and I guess maybe is related to that, but it's kind of where the rubber hits the road. We have to be the best at using AI. It's not just enough to have open source models. You have to use those models. It's not just enough to have the largest AI, closed source AI platform companies exist. We have to use those. And that's going to require really reorienting ourselves around the opportunity that AI presents for the federal government in its mission, right? So to get the Department of Defense, to get the intelligence agencies using AI, and also for our industry, using it on factory floors. And that's really where I think, in some sense, the rubber hits the road on this issue. Competing, when we think about like international competition, national competitiveness with China is not really just about developing the models, but it's using the models. And we have a lot of work to do to really be the world's best at using the models. But I think we can do it. And Palantir is that's kind of our bread and butter, is to help large institutions do exactly that.
As I sit and listen and just think about who's on the panel, it really is the best of the best. And it represents kind of the whole diversity of the AI stack. But our purpose and our mission with the center is how do we try to build a bipartisan consensus, a national consensus on the policy formations, similar to what we did in the 1990s around all of our new digital infrastructure, cable, satellite, wireless, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the early internet, moving from a public to a commercial internet. And that period of time, tremendous bipartisan national commitment to move from monopolistic policies to competition policies. Colin and I, had the good fortune of working for great members and being in Washington during that time. And I'd like Colin to kind of give his historical principled view of how from each decade of technology, there's certain enduring values. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about what we started yesterday and what we've been doing over the last year. But yesterday, we had 3 working groups with key congressional staff, had the speaker leadership, committees of jurisdiction leadership on a bipartisan basis. And there were round tables where our members and others could come and just talk about, okay, what's the best way to promote AI competition? What's the best way to promote AI infrastructure? What is the best way to have education and workforce training for all Americans that train them in the uses of AI? So Colin, I'll let you kind of talk about the principles, and then I want the rest of the panel to talk about opportunities and risk in policy that we face and how hopefully in this time, at this moment, we can get policy right.
Excellent. Well, I know this room is probably full of people who are somewhat familiar with communications policy principles that have animated U.S. telecommunications policy for decades. And coming from the 1934 Communications Act, from the era of the New Deal, the three core principles were universal service, diversity, and localism. So those were the three guide stars that policymakers during that early era put into the communication statutes of the country that guided policymaking literally for 60-something years until the 1990s. And universal service, most of the people with ENCOMPAS roots will understand that principle, and it was about making sure that everybody in the country had access to affordable telephone service. At that time in 1934, only 20% of the country's residential households had telephone service at that time. So that was a big commitment by the country to building out the infrastructure and building it out in a way that served everybody, urban and rural. Diversity and localism are largely around our media policies, a diversity of voices in our media mix to ensure that we didn't just have one national ventriloquist that was putting out different content, but making sure that there were independent individual voices that could contribute to the civic life of the country. Localism was focused on licensing of broadcast licenses initially, and that meant that it wasn't going to be a media mix dominated by licensees in New York City, but that there would be local licensees, local radio stations, local television stations that could preempt programming from the national network to bring you something of local interest that was important. And so those networks and affiliates was something that was very different as a policy to European countries and other countries around the world, which typically had one national broadcaster, one national network in television and radio. In the 1990s, there were two technological innovative phenomena that hit. One was the rapid advance of digital, replacing analog technologies across the communications sectors. Cable, telephony, satellite, wireless moved from analog to digital. And then, of course, the rise of the public internet. And those two factors contributed to the need to change our communication statutes. We didn't throw out the old principles, however, when we did so. We retained the values of that earlier era, and we simply added a fourth value. And the fourth value was openness. Open interconnection, open markets, and open embrace of innovation. No longer would we countenance monopoly provision of services, whether that was a monopoly cable operator in your hometown or Ma Bell. And so that embrace of open competition, innovation, open architecture, internet is now a consistent through line as we get to the next wave of technological innovation, which is AI. And with that, openness, the openness principle is a natural through line to open source AI in our telecommunications policy. And that's why when you look at the geopolitical rivalries that we have to confront, the challenges that we have, it's one of the areas where you can find bipartisan support, and that's around national security. And so if you think of dealing with the AI sector and the challenge posed by a rising China in this space, and you're not going to unleash the power of innovation around open source AI, it's like trying to win the Daytona 500 but keeping the parking brake engaged. You have to release the brake, and you have to let all of our innovators, all of the entrepreneurial spirit and that openness help us to out-innovate and prevail.
Miriam?
I love the last couple notes of entrepreneurship, because that's very much the perspective that I would bring to this discussion, is sort of for those smaller, newer players and startups. Really just having aside from obviously open source, they're using technology, they're creating incredible products, but if they can't compete for the business, then they'll never be able to have those contributions reach you and everyone else that they're trying to reach. So it sounds boring, and it's definitely not something that will probably excite most people when they hear the word of procurement reform, but I'll make it more interesting.
Love it.
Just But you know, actually, Palantir, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 1996 that sued the government and broke the dam to just be able to compete for contracts. Is that right? 96.
Off by 10 years, but yeah, the 2000s.
Well, thank you for doing that. But it really did break the dam, and it did sort of open up the perspective of being able to just compete for contracts that can bring those technologies to the fore. So, you know, really hope opportunities that are there is that to leverage existing pathways, for example, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or creating national security exemptions, because, you know, with the new power competition and instability being the new normal, it's critical that we do reindustrialize, bring manufacturing back to America, create more defense tech companies that are producing at scale versus, you know, what we've been doing in the past. And so those are really national security, you could say, reasons to expedite that procurement process. But also the fragmentation we're seeing at the state level, that's a huge, you know, risk in a sense, because you don't want there to be uncertainty for these smaller companies. They're just trying to, you know, keep going day in and day out to try to get that next sort of, to try to even be seen at scale. And so it's hard for a company that has 10 employees to try to figure out how to comply in 20 different states with different AI policies. So the fragmentation that I think Europe has seen, we don't want to see that happen in the US. And so as much as they want to have sort of they don't want to regulate in any sort of drastic way, I think that it would be great to have that kind of business certainty for the smaller players as well as the larger players. And then I just want to emphasize, I think it's really important that we reskill and emphasize reskilling, and to bring that technology to every classroom and every opportunity to have Americans not be left behind, essentially. So we've seen that happen before with manufacturing, and we obviously don't want to see that happen again.
Victoria, I believe yesterday when we were on the Hill, you talked about hundreds of state initiatives legislatively or on the regulatory front. Is it time for us, or hopefully is it possible for us in this Congress to adopt some form of a national framework that would promote an all of the above AI model and not, you know, preclude or have any type of a regulatory limitation on the AI ecosystem? I think the country has really made a pivot from where we were a year and a half to 2 years ago, where it was more about the risk, now shifting to what are the great opportunities, the great uses, and the great applications. But talk to us a little bit, if we were successful in the internet age because we had a national framework, should we create a national framework in this case?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned getting past the doomerism. It was sort of useful, I think, to kind of get that all out of our system. And I was heartened to hear during the conversation on the Hill yesterday that folks are realizing that it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And so thinking again with my competition hat on, I think about regulation is something that you want to put in when there's been a market failure. Ideally, you have market competition. And there may be some situations where we're making a normative, you know, policy judgment. No, we want things to be a certain way. But otherwise, particularly when you're talking about economic matters, you hope for competition to be the first natural thing. So the first thing to do would be to look at our existing toolkit. And then the second thing to do might be to not create too many problems. And right now, you mentioned the state bills. I think I saw in a third-party tracker that it's like over 700 bills have been introduced in 2025 in the states seeking to regulate AI in one way or another. And so for a technology that is sort of inherently at least national and really global, it starts getting pretty difficult for anyone in the stack, and certainly for deployers or users of the technology to be complying with overlapping and potentially contradictory regulation. So I think one of the things that we could do is look at the example in Europe. And I don't think I'm saying anything out of school here, because European economists and policymakers have begun to recognize this issue and talk about it publicly, that there's an existing and rapidly growing gap in GDP between Europe and the United States. And the economists who study these issues have come to realize increasingly that that gap can be attributed to technological integration and adoption in the economy. And part of what's thwarting that are overlapping and onerous regulations. And so the US model of relying on well-functioning markets, I think, gold star for the United States on that. And we're in a critical moment to make sure that in the rush to get things right, that we don't sort of overcorrect. And so give some space for federal policymakers to sort out, how are we going to find the right balance here?
Kara?
Actually, I wanted to pick up on something that Colin had talked about with access, and then what Anthony was saying about trying to be the best at using open source models. One of the things in the conversations we were having yesterday that really kind of came out was that the big issue is really about compute resources and trying to discuss like what's going to happen in terms of just the overall energy that's needed and the actual resources that are needed to run all of the AI models, both LLM and diffusion models that are being created. And it was interesting, the access to compute resources is a bit constrained. And I was talking to a colleague at Anthropic, and they were saying in the next 2 years, by 2027, we are going to have run out of the resources that we need at the rate that we're going at. And actually, Anthony would probably be able to speak to this a little bit better. You could do some fancy math and tell me exactly, the date and the month and when this is going to happen. But basically, we have 2 years to try to figure this out. And I was just thinking about how with the open source models that we've been able to utilize, because they're already pre-trained, because they're already giving you that underlying kind of foundation and infrastructure, that we're not having to train everything from scratch, that we're able to run a lot of these models on a lot less chips, on a lot less energy. We're being able to be a lot more efficient in kind of putting things together. And so it's really actually, again, helping mid-sized companies like Canva, helping startups that are trying to break into this space that have great ideas that are working with General Catalyst. That is the way that we're going to be able to have this healthy competitive market and really be able to out-innovate and out-move any bad actors, any other countries like China that are really starting to creep up on us. This is how we have to figure out how to be the best at using these open source models. I don't know, Anthony, you probably have some thoughts, but I was just thinking as we were saying all these things, like actually it's open source is the key to unlock this. It's just how do we now look at the policy solutions to deal with that looming kind of Damocles sword over our head with the compute issues and the energy infrastructure that's needed.
I'm going to attempt to talk about regulatory frameworks for a second. So apologies. Again, I try and sort of think of things sort of from my perspective as someone who uses and builds AI systems. And one thing that's clear is that any regulations have to be use case centered. If you think of just the fact that OpenAI could be used, an OpenAI model, general purpose, or Llama, I'm sorry, yeah, open source models as well, right? Llama could be used, for like a medical application, and it could be used to do, inventory management, an inventory management app. You're not going to be able to regulate at the model level. The same model is used in completely different use cases. And we see that all the time, that any kind of sensible regulation has to be about how the model is being used, its impact on the world, not the model itself. And this is really key for open source because the open source developers, they can be big institutions like Facebook, but they can also be some Meta, or they can also be some graduate students somewhere and producing model as part of their research, which is they then release to the community. And it doesn't make sense for that person to hold liability if I use the model to do something, bad or illegal, right? So the focus, where we do need to regulate, it needs to be about use cases, not about the underlying model.
And speaking of a regulatory framework, part of the work of the center last year, we produced our first AI report, a series of recommendations. We're now preparing to launch our 2.0 report and submit to the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, who've asked for comments, public comments, on what AI policy or incentives or infrastructure can be. Alan, I don't know if you want to talk about the report, the process of the report, how we put it together, and some of our key recommendations.
Sure. So the development of the report was a multi-month process, and we solicited input from various INCOMPAS members and other experts in the field, including folks in academia. And the report tries to capture essential areas of public policy for advancing an AI public policy framework, essentially to put America in the lead. And to do it in a way that allows us to take public policy note of the advances in the technology so that we're hitting our marks with respect to where we engage to suggest any regulations in a sensible way, but otherwise pointing the way for government to advance the deployment and further innovation investment, and otherwise make sure that we're looking at the doomerism era in the rearview mirror and really looking in much closer, with a much closer lens at some of the key infrastructure elements. So there's a lot about advancing AI that goes to the deployment of fiber, energy resources, and the revolution in AI is going to help breed a parallel revolution in energy simultaneously. And I think there's an opportunity to leverage both of those revolutions in a way that advances the broad interests of the country, but also the broad interests, if we do it right, of communities across the country, so that it's not a bi-coastal story, but that we're reaching deep into the heartland as well, so that every community benefits from what the technology can bring. So some of the high-level recommendations in the report will speak to some of the siting issues that many people in this room are quite familiar with, that will talk about all of the above AI from the standpoint of fully embracing open source AI, while at the same time also embracing proprietary models and letting the marketplace really dictate what are the best applications for your business or your community or your personal needs. And so making sure that we're at the same time taking advantage of powers that the government can move forward on its own ministerial basis, that you don't necessarily have to wait for Congress to act to deal with some of the procurement reform issues. Those can often be dealt with by agencies and departments by themselves. And then finally, the government itself, for purposes of training models, is an immense repository of data. So, we were meeting on Capitol Hill yesterday, and across the street was the Library of Congress. There's a lot of data in the Library of Congress that could be used perhaps for training models. Much of that content is already in the public domain, but there are also other departments across the government that may have data resources of great value as a public resource for the AI ecosystem. So for example, if you think of the data that the Veterans Administration has with respect to running VA hospitals, that could be of great value and put to use by people trying to develop AI healthcare applications. All of these things, of course, have to be done with a high degree of ethics, They have to be done with appropriate privacy protections in place at the same time. But there are immense resources the government can bring to bear to advance open source AI that can advance the broad ecosystem. And again, at the end of the day, for policymakers in Washington, this revolution has to work for the country, but it has to work for ordinary Americans as well. And so they'll be looking closely. So, in some respects, when you talk about the energy infrastructure issues, nothing is going to animate an elected official this summer more than if AI starts to cause brownouts because the electricity grid is under stress. During the height of a heat wave. So those are the kinds of things that the country, in some respects, has no choice but to move forward. And so we're trying to make sure we get the attention of policymakers in a way so that we can do it deliberatively, with intention, and do it in a really smart way. So those comments will be filed. The draft report that we put out in its 1.0 version is still on the website at the AI Competition Center.
And just real quickly, for the report or the recommendations, anything that y'all would like to highlight, and I know that each of y'all may be doing your own comments, would love for just that, and then I'll wrap up as to why this is so important to Encompass and Encompass members. Basically, if you think about the streaming and over the top and the internet and the commercial internet, really drove new economics into our fiber, our broadband, into many of the companies that are traditional members of Encompass. We heard from the CEO of Zayo today that they're expecting in 5 years that their fiber routes connecting to data centers is going to increase by a multiple of 5 to 6 from current capacity. All of this revolution is then driving back into the infrastructure that our members build, into the communities and the businesses and the enterprises and the universities and the hospitals and the anchor institutions that we serve. So this huge new revolutionary technology really goes back into the infrastructure that we build. And so that's why we have a self-interest in putting together a coalition that is unique and distinct in Washington, which is across the entire substack of energy, data centers, fiber, and the developers of proprietary to open models, from little to big tech. And so all of the above abundance across all of those sectors is really our message and the recommendations that we're trying to pursue in our filings and our comments. But I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel as we wrap up.
I'll just add one thing in addition to everything we discuss on open source and energy and everything else. One thing that I do think the Trump administration does well is, really working with the private sector and industry. And I think that's sort of an important element, not just with the administration, but on Capitol Hill and everywhere, working with, nonprofits and civil society and industry of all sizes, small and large, and getting those insights, which they did also in the Bipartisan AI Insights Forums. Just to continue to do that, to leverage the learnings from all of those groups is really critical as well.
It was very well said. I don't have anything to add.
We need more energy.
Yeah. Yes, that's the main takeaway. And probably even a little afternoon energy. So hopefully you're all going to get some caffeine in you in a second. The only thing I would say is that true to the American values and spirit, I think to the administration, I'd say just double down and let America out innovate. Like the open source community and technology allows for things to be collaborative and to supercharge how quickly and at pace we're able to move. And so I would say continue to do that and unshackle the companies and allow them to do that, to innovate.
I would just double down on the point about data. Historically, data has fueled AI innovation. The availability of certain data sets propels model development. But this is also a win-win for the government because when people will build models that will support, the agency's missions that have released that data. So it's just incredibly valuable for the ecosystem to double down on the data releases.
Well, I want to thank everyone on this panel, all the good work that we worked jointly together on the report, and the work ahead as we advocate and educate around the Capitol and in the new administration. And thank you all for being part of INCOMPAS, all your support and your engagement on this initiative. So thank you.